let's get right into it. So Alex, you don't have to talk too much about amplifiers yet, but maybe just tell me a little about yourself, where you're from, and anything else that you think the people might like to hear.
Okay, thanks for joining, everybody. My name's Alex Gaziano. I live in Seattle, Washington, where I work from my home shop here, and I don't know if you'll ask me this, but I've been building amps since about 2009 in the Northwest, and Olympia and Portland, and here in Seattle. And
cool. So can you name some jobs or hobbies that are more dangerous than amp building?
Yeah, a lot. Amp building doesn't have to be that dangerous. Woodworking is really, the guy that makes my cabinets, I wouldn't want to use a table saw. I'm really scared of woodworking tools. Bus driver.
But amp building is not the safest job you could possibly have.
No, it's not. You have to learn. The first thing I learned actually about building amps was tube amp safety, because I did know before I started that it was dangerous because of high voltages involved. And so I wanted to make sure that I knew how to not get shocked or electrocuted.
So how do you not get shocked? And how do you get shocked, and how do you not get shocked?
You get shocked by not knowing what parts of the amp, well, you shouldn't be poking around in an amp, but it's good to know where the high voltages are in the amp. You must have you can only know that by knowing the amplifier, but also testing with a voltmeter. So that's a really important tool to have. And then one common, the current is what's the dangerous part, and it can stop your heart. So it's important when you're probing into an amp, like when you're testing voltages, that you only use one hand, and you don't have the other hand resting on the amp or anything, because the current can flow through your body and that can hurt you. Boy, this is a dark way to start this.
Well, hold on a second. You got to see the full picture first. So despite the inherent dangers and the possibility of dying for nothing, why did you decide to go down this path in the first place? What made you interested in amp building? And go ahead.
Well, I've always lived dangerously. No, but I just really wanted to learn how to fix my own amps. I'd always, when I could finally get a tube amp, I really liked it, but it wasn't breaking all the time. But being young, it felt like it needed a lot of maintenance, and it was really expensive to get it fixed, and rightfully so, because it takes a lot of skill. But around here in Seattle, it's about $75 an hour to get your amp worked on. So I thought it would be fun to learn how to fix my own. And so I got pretty lucky, because I just Googled tube amps in my town, and I found an old guy, Dale Murrow, who was willing to show me some stuff, and he got me started and showed me a bunch of resources and let me hang out in his shop a little bit. So I got really lucky in that regard. He's the one who taught me about amp safety too.
Can you talk a little bit about Dale? Because that's kind of sounds like something from the Once Upon a Time, to have like an actual kind of mentor and you kind of apprentice or whatever.
And actually now his nephew is my cabinet builder. So that was pretty cool. But I got really lucky. Dale had just been retired, and he still makes amps, not a lot, but called old school amps. And I just got super lucky, because now I know that amp builders just really don't like to take on apprentices, and it's usually more work than it is helpful. And that's how it was when I started hanging out with him.
So why do you think he took you on? You think you just made a good impression?
I just wrote him a really nice email. I think he was surprised to get the email from me that I had found him, and he happened to just live down the street. And yeah, I think he was kind of flattered. So I got really lucky because most people just would say, sorry, man, I don't have time.
And maybe, if any anecdotes come to mind, I'd love to hear one, but can you talk a little bit about what, just maybe what it was like, I guess, to learn from him? Was it structured? Or were you kind of just watching him do stuff? Was he kind of explaining stuff to you?
It wasn't really structured at all. He was trying to show me stuff and he wasn't really a teacher, so he didn't really know how to get like where to begin, but we did begin with safety. And then he showed me some overall like amp construction techniques. And then he showed me, he went to the electronics store with me and like showed me what kind of solder to get, what meter to get, like really basic stuff that I kind of took for granted, because when you're really a beginner, that stuff's really intimidating. And it's hard to get straight answers, especially because there's so much information. And it was nice to just have someone say, get these pliers, get this meter, this one's fine.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about, you mentioned amp construction in a little bit, but so now that we know about, you wanted to fix your own stuff, you met Dale, which was just kind of serendipitous, right? What's the next step on the trajectory as far as then actually starting to build your own stuff?
So Dale decided that the best way for me to learn was to build a kit amp, like a small amp. And the kit was actually an amp that he was making and put together. It was like a really typical first amp people build is like a Fender Champ or Princeton. Princeton's the same, and this is like the very oldest version of it. They call them like a Tweed Champ or a Tweed Princeton from the 50s or earlier. And they're really simple. They just have one power tube, one preamp tube, and the Princeton has a volume and a tone control. So they're like pretty much the simplest amp you can build. That still sounds okay. And he kind of just gave me all the parts and the schematic and a little layout that he had made, which is the physical, how the parts physically are oriented in the amp. And he kind of just said here, and I kind of went for it and put it together, almost like a Lego set or something, but more dangerous.
So I like that you told that story, because actually years ago, kind of when I was getting into electronic stuff, we had a similar conversation, and you kind of recommended a Champ as a good place to start with tubes. And I did find actually that a lot of the very complicated, sort of convoluted, either from reading the schematic to understanding like how it actually works, to sort of knowing like which components do what, right? All of that stuff, after making that amp, I felt like I had kind of understood a little bit more. So maybe talk a little bit about like what the process of actually making that amp, because you could have just watched some YouTube videos, you could have just, you could have taken an amp apart and fixed it a little bit or something, whatever, but making it from scratch, how do you feel like that process kind of helped you understand, and how it sort of informed what happened next?
Well, now that I'm thinking about it, the really first thing I did with an amp was I modified an amp that I already had. And that was interesting, but I didn't really know what I was doing. He kind of just told me what to do. And so I did learn some stuff from that. But when I started building that first amp, it really helped me learn a lot of just basics, like kind of like about, so what was the question again exactly?
Well, like, I'm interested in, because the process of actually making it, right? Because that's what you do, right? You're not, you're not like buying it and rebranding it or whatever, right? You're taking something from scratch. I mean, now obviously you have, certain things that, you make 10 chassis and you pre-drill them or whatever. But when anyone starts out, right, you the first thing that you actually make from scratch, right? So you didn't, there was no amp there, and then you put it together, you hooked it up, right, and then you turned it on, and it worked, right, and it did the thing it was.
No, it didn't work.
Okay, or it didn't work. Yeah. So so exactly. So how did that process sort of talk about that process, if you just try to think back on it, and how that eventually informed what happened next? Because obviously you liked doing that enough to keep doing it. Right.
Yeah, I like putting things together, and I liked it's kind of like putting together a puzzle or something, especially when you start designing your own. But um, yeah, I don't know why it's hard. It's actually hard for me to remember what that experience was like.
Well, you remembered it didn't work. So how about that? We can start there.
I remember when I turned it on, I thought, is that smoke? And some smoke started coming out. And I thought, oh no, my first amp, and now it's on fire. It wasn't on fire, but a component was smoking. So I took it over to Dale's, and we had found that the way the way this amp was constructed is on an eyelet board. It's a little board. In this case, is made out of a material called garolite. It's like a non-conductive, like glass, fiberglass stuff, and has little terminals that you can solder the parts into, and then you connect the wires to those. Well, I had put too much solder and it dripped through into, so it was touching the chassis, and this was like actually a high voltage point. So it was like a direct short to ground. The chassis is connected. That's the metal enclosure. It's connected to ground. So it was a short. So the resistor started smoking. So we figured it out. So that was my first learning from experience moment. And I actually built this tool. That was when he thought you better have a current limiter. So that was when I first built my first current limiter, which is something I still have and I still use every time I turn on an amp.
And so what is that in layman's terms, if you can, we can talk about that.
Yeah, well, the way that this is built, and this is a real like DIY way of doing, I don't even know how else you would do it, but it's literally just a light bulb socket that's in series with the live wire coming from your outlet, and depending on what wattage bulb you have, it limits the current to the amp. So what will happen if there's a short in the amp, the light bulb will glow really bright, and so you have this visual indicator to know that there's something not right with the amp. If the amp's drawing too much current, the bulb will light up.
Yeah, so you're basically putting a light bulb in between your amp and the wall socket.
Yeah.
And the light bulb it has, yeah, because you'll see when it glows bright, that's bad.
Yeah, so that was the first tool. That was the first tool I made for myself, and that was something I did early on too. Is I started making my own little handy test tools and stuff like that. So I just found, okay, I think I found pretty quickly with building my own first amp that there was a lot more involved than I thought. So it wasn't just about reading the schematic and figuring out how to put it together. It was like the tools you needed and the test tools, and like, well, how do you get the lettering on the front for the controls? How do you, like there's like and of course the sound too. I wasn't even into like tweaking the sound part really yet. So there was just, I just kind of if you're the kind of person who likes to learn and gets bored easily, a hobby like electronics is really fun because there's a technical part to it and there's an artistic part to it. There's like a visual part to it too. And then there's of course the sound part to it. So that's why I'm probably still doing it, because, from the beginning, it's really interesting and I'm always learning new stuff all the time.
Yeah, so let's we've talked a little bit about kind of you getting started, about some of the technical stuff, about kind of the first your first foray into it. Just to kind of wrap it up as far as talking about the trajectory from sort of learning to knowing how you're doing. Talk about kind of when did you make the decision to become like an amp builder and seller? Obviously that could have been over a period of time, so you don't have to tell me about a moment, but how did it, if you can just summarize sort of what was the trajectory from just like building a champ that didn't even work in the first place? What were the steps along the way to kind of, building boutique amps now?
Well, I liked building the champ, but it was pretty useless to me as far as like something I would actually use, because I didn't really like the sound of it, and I was already used to playing in bands and playing really loud amps. So I naturally wanted to build myself a louder amp, which there's more complexity, and it costs a lot more to make one. I think probably the parts to build a 50-watt amp, even without a head box, is like $700 or something like that. And I didn't have that money, so I knew a lot of you know, by then some of my friends had known that I started making amps. So I thought, oh, I could probably convince some of my friends to let me build them an amp for just the cost of the parts to get some experience in and do that. So that's what I started doing. So people were pretty interested in the idea. So I pretty quickly got some people to, you know, they sold some stuff and gave me some money. So
Those are called investors.
investors, yes. Mm-hmm.
But they didn't get any benefit from any dividend.
They got an amp out of it, and those amps are still around, so they still work. So, but I check in on them every once in a while. But but so it kind of happened naturally that way, and then through that, some other people found out about it. Like actually my bandmate Justin, I'm in a band with him now, but before that we weren't even friends, and we kind of became friends because he had seen one of these first amps that I had made for my friend Nick, and he said, "Hey, can you build me one?" And so, you know, he was we knew each other a little, but he was pretty much a stranger to me at that time. So I figured I could charge him some money. So he paid a little bit over the cost of parts, and that was one of my first bigger amps I made.
Mm-hmm.
But so it kind of happened naturally like that, and I didn't have anything else going on. I had a job building electric skateboards for this guy, but
wow, that could have panned out too, potentially.
yeah, I don't know. They were kind of hack. They were like, he used like a Nintendo Wii remote. He literally hacked a Nintendo Wii remote to be the controller for the electric skateboard. He ended up selling the company, but it was a former engineer for Hewlett Packard designing printers. But I got some good experience from that job about like you know, where to source parts. And actually the company that makes my chassis for my amps was the company that fabricated these custom skateboard trucks with like a little gear on the side to connect to the motor. So that company, they mainly build stuff for freight liners and stuff, but they make my amp chassis.
Oh, that's a cool connection.
Yeah.
We're glad to have you here today and not in the electric skateboarding world. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of creative aspect of it, right? Because I think a lot of people, you know, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening, like the technical aspect of it, you know, it's daunting a little bit, but it kind of makes sense. You know, you put things together, you solder them, you know, over time you understand more and more. But the creative aspect of it is something that it's not so straightforward. A lot of amp designs and a lot of kits and all of these things, right? They're kind of basically just they're just making the same 3 or 4 amps over and over again, right? With kind of slight modifications. So talk about where's the room kind of like for creativity, and at what point we can talk about the design of the amp aesthetically itself too, you know, but at what point did you feel like you were able to like kind of start being creative with it and actually making it like your own amp rather than just a version of an existing amp, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that my amps actually still are versions of existing amps, and as you know, Ilya, my interviewer here, does amp repairs and among many other things, but he knows that a lot of the DNA of even the most modern looking tube amp has its roots in the older amps, and partially is that just the kind of I've heard it called like the inertia of the industry. It's just like, well, this is like guitar players are used to a certain sound, so you can use it as building blocks. And what the cool thing about amps is that even if on paper they look very similar, they can sound really different. But I do kind of I don't really like designing amps from total scratch. I mean, I could, but I really have a reverence for old amps, and especially like the big old amps. And so I usually
and just name a few of those so people know kind of what we're talking about.
Like Marshalls, High Watts, Mad Amps, Fenders, all of them.
And when we say old, yeah, we're talking about things that were sort of designed and made in the 60s and 70s. Originally.
Yeah, like at the beginnings of like when electric guitar music became popular, and you know, as much as music has changed, guitar music has even changed, a lot of like the core fundamental sounds of it are really pretty much exactly the same as they were, and people still searching for those old sounds. So it's natural that even new amps would be able to be able to get those sounds. But so like a lot of what I do is I like to start with that sound, and it's kind of a challenge sometimes for me to get an amp to sound just like an old amp. And if I'm lucky, I'll have one of the old amps to compare against. And then my design philosophy is always like, get the exact sound of the old amp, but also make it do a lot more without without like, inhibiting the original sound. So it's like keeping the original sound pure, but letting the amp do more things that are useful. And it might be sonically, like you can get more distortion, or it can be cleaner, or the EQ has different range of controls. Or it might be just things like making the amp more reliable or less noisy. And kind of like putting my own twist on it. And I feel like honestly, that's what 99% of amp builders do, is they take classic designs and kind of put their own spin on it. Does that answer the question?
No, it does. It does. And I think it leads kind of to the next question of, as far as designing them then, and what makes them sell, I think a lot of what people like about music is how it looks. And that goes for how people perform on stage, the types of guitars they like to play, the amps they like to play. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's just the nature of art is that people like the sensual visual part of it, right? So just like with anything else, how an amp looks, I think, has a lot to do with why people like it. Obviously it also has to sound good, but talk about how you came. Because your amps do also have a distinctive look, so what was the design process, and how did you kind of, it's trickier because then, are you kind of same thing, inspired by the old ones, kind of doing your own spin on it, how did you kind of work out the look of the amps?
Yeah, I wanted them to look, yes, it's really similar actually. Like, I don't think I realized this, but I wanted them to look classic, but also kind of be a little bit different. I knew I wanted them to look more minimal, and
more minimal than what?
I don't know, than like a newer PV or something, or like then the amps that were around, like the amps that were brand new in 2009, I guess. I can't remember what they were. But I like the look of high watts and matchless amps and I like the look of a lot of old amps, but the ones that I thought I wanted something that kind of wasn't gonna, I wanted something that wasn't gonna look too stylized in like one direction, like not look too metal, or even like not look too modern, but not look too vintage, not look too, like I don't know. I kind of wanted someone to look at it and just to think that it looked kind of classic, and not think, oh, that's like a metal amp. I don't think that's the one for me, without even hearing it.
And it's a good point, because if we look at like a Marshall amp that has like a lot of negative space kind of on the front, it's got like the tag, the knobs, and then kind of that's it. And then there's just a bunch of, it might be one color, a different color, but there's something about the contours of it and about these things that any band can play it. And you would see it in a lot of different contexts, like you were saying, right? And if you see somebody setting up with an amp like that, it could be, they could be playing it super loud and crunchy, and it could be a crazy hardcore band, or, they might just like the tones and it's like a jazz band, and whatever it is. So I think that's a good point, that the key in this design aspect also seems to be learning from the stuff that's already kind of worked, right? And then the stuff that people like to buy, right?
Yeah, and a lot of it is being really, especially when you're first starting, if you're not don't have a lot of experience in like, I don't know what it would be called, industrial design, you don't really know how to make things. So you're somewhat limited by the materials. Like I was lucky to have a cabinet builder to work with, but you know, if you were making the amps yourself, you might be limited, your design might be limited to like what you can physically make with your tooling and your knowledge. Or a good example is like my control panels for the amps, the part that actually has the lettering that says, you know, treble, bass, etc. They, you know, I had no idea how to make those, and I had to do a lot of research to figure out how it had been done before. And I was having trouble. A lot of the stuff's like kind of secretive, and I was having trouble finding who I could have fabricate that stuff. So the original way I did it was like really DIY. It's like buying pieces of plexiglass and then having them silk screened on the backside. If anyone's heard, probably most people listening to this have heard of a Marshall Plexi. Well, they get the name from having plexiglass control panels, and how they're done is there's clear plexiglass and then it's silk screened from the backside in reverse. So when you read it from the front, the lettering is behind the plexiglass. So I thought, oh, I can make them like that. And I was drilling the plastic myself and having them silk screened by a guy that made t-shirts. And it was like a ton of work. And, you know, but now I found this big company to in Ohio that makes a lot of control panels, and they're aluminum now, but like stuff like that. Like I never really wanted to have plexiglass control panels at the beginning, but I literally had no other way of doing it. So that's what I did. And kind of stuff like that. So there's some constraints that kind of contribute to the design too.
Do you feel like there's kind of room to grow and kind of to change it? You know, I mean, just like with a lot of stuff, you know, it's one thing for a website or a beverage to rebrand, right? But for an amp, you know, you kind of have your look. And do you feel like it's something that, you know, you're thinking about things you want to tweak and change, or is it something that you're like, I'm happy with this, I'm just going to roll with this until people stop buying it?
I'm pretty happy. I made some slight changes, but not like big changes, especially like I don't have like alternate logos or anything like that. But for example, for a while I was making a combo amp, and I discontinued it because I wasn't really like selling a lot of them, and they weren't really like loud enough to use in a band. And I just and I never really liked the look of it. I didn't really like how my bigger heads translated to a combo look, for example. Like what I like about certain amplifier heads, it is different from what I like about combo amps. So what I decided to do recently is I'm gonna start making combo amps again, but they're gonna have like a pretty different look, like almost be kind of a separate line. So but in general, yeah, like for the past 12 years, I haven't really changed much because, you know, I always think about that with restaurants, you know, they don't really like, I think, God, don't they get sick of making the same thing? But there's this customer expectation that it's going to taste exactly the same every time they get it.
Yeah, and if they don't like it, they'll go to a different restaurant.
Right. So yeah, I don't really, I feel glad that even though a decade has passed, I still do like the look of my amps. You know, if I look back in 2009 and see what clothes I was wearing, I'm not happy about it.
You're not?
But I look at the amps, I think, oh, I still like the look of them. So
what were you wearing in 2009?
I don't know, probably shirts that were too small.
Ponchos.
Probably not much different, but subtly different enough to just go.
Yeah. Oh, okay, let's do a little fun little visual aspect of this, of this interview. It'll be a little bit more technical, but honestly, what I would kind of rather you do is come at it more from a demystification standpoint. So I'm going to show you something. You're going to tell me what it is and explain it as if it is, you can't use, it's like taboo. You can't use any electronics words.
I hope I know the answer.
Oh, you're going to know the answer. Okay. So Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is this?
That's
You can name it. You can name it, but in the explanation, you can't use any electronics words.
Oh, okay, sure. Like, well, yeah, that's what's called a tube, and or in the UK they call them valves, and how much do you want me to explain about it?
Well, I mean, it's called a valve for a reason. Tube is a little more mystifying, but so what is it valve exactly? Does it control water?
No, it controls electricity, electrical current, and the tubes are what is partially responsible for amplifying the sound. And like, for example, that particular tube is called a dual triode. It actually has it has two tubes inside of one glass envelope. And in a guitar amp, the purpose of that tube is to amplify the sound, which begins at your guitar. Your pickup in your guitar is an electromagnet, and it produces, when you hit the string, it produces a very small signal that goes through your guitar cable into your amp. And usually the very first thing it hits is one of those tubes. And what that does is it makes your guitar signal louder. So it can be manipulated, and should I keep going?
No, that's good. Next.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to show you two and talk about what they are and why we need two different kinds.
Those are power tubes. Those are the tubes in your amp that make it loud. And why we need two different kinds. So
I mean, at your house, you usually just have one kind of light bulb. Why would you need different kind of bulbs in your amp?
Well, it's kind of like different light bulbs. Well, the old incandescent bulbs have different power, different brightness. So the different tubes can produce different power levels in conjunction with the power and output transformer in your amp.
And so if you were listening to an amp and you didn't know what kind of tubes were in it, do you think you could take an educated guess?
Power tubes?
Mm-hmm.
Now, power tubes don't make that much of a difference in the sound until they start clipping, being distorted. When they get pushed to a saturation point, especially the bigger ones, and there's other more technical reasons why, and a lot of big amps, you can't hear the difference that much. But I could probably tell you with some of the smaller power tubes, like if I hear EL84s, which is a smaller common power tube found in like Vox and some old Selmer amps, for example, but and a lot of amps, but they have a certain quality, kind of a buzziness to raspiness to them that I could probably tell. But like a big, loud, clean amp, somebody playing clean, I could tell you what kind of pickups were in the guitar or even probably speaker before I could guess if it was a 6L6 or an EL34. Those are common power tube types.
Okay, next. Ready?
You tell, Ilya?
Can I tell?
Yeah.
I think so.
I A/B amps all the time. I have this rig where I can A/B amps through the same cabinet on the fly with a foot switch. And I'll put two amps next to each other, exact same amp with different power tubes, and go back and forth. And I've done a lot of recordings of this to see if I can tell. You can really tell if you listen really close, but it's really subtle. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have to do a challenge at some point.
Yeah.
Okay, what's this?
Let me see the wires. That's probably an output transformer. Was I right?
You are right. And why do people talk about this a lot? And what difference does it make? It just looks like a big black box.
Yeah. The output transformer, the job of the output transformer is to take the power tube signal and transform it to a high current, low impedance to drive the speaker. Why do people talk about it? I don't know. There's a lot of mystery around transformers.
Oh yeah, I mean, they're mysterious. Look at it.
They're black boxes. A lot of people don't know how to make their own. I don't make my own, but I know enough to design them, to spec them to the transformer place. But people think that they sound different. But Boy, that's a big discussion. But some of the, if you get a really small one, you can actually just, and you drive your amp really hard, you can actually distort them. And so some people actually, I guess they like the sound of that, but some of them are more high, what they call hi-fi. They have a wider frequency range, but the guitar or even bass doesn't have that wide of a frequency range, and the speakers can't even really reproduce that much. So a lot of what you do in a guitar amp is roll off the very low and high end of the audio signal. And so I don't know. Yeah, if that's you're asking, but
no, I'm just, it's just one of those things that the word comes up a lot in musician
right.
talk, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is a little bit more mysterious than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, one broader point I could make is that, like, the more technical you get into design of electronics design, it's really demystifying. It kind of takes a little bit of the fun out of it. When you realize that there's no magic, that everything's measurable, but I still think transformers are cool. They're heavy. They're made of iron.
But is everything measurable? Because I think part of what makes amps kind of interesting is that people like it when they sound bad, right? As in when they break up, when they distort. And it is possible to measure distortion, I guess, but it's difficult to, in your kind of, trials and tribulations of design, how have you found that balance of like getting things to sound bad, but also still somehow pleasing, to like the average guitar player's ear, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's kind of like, especially with distortion, it's kind of an acquired taste. Like, some people hear certain, and even more striking example might be with like guitar pedals, like a fuzz pedal versus a distortion pedal. Like, and that happens in amps too, like a more kind of like ratty, fuzzy, out of control, compressed, overloaded sound. Some people really like that and find it really musical, but other people find that kind of distortion really unusable and terrible, and they would prefer maybe no distortion at all, but maybe they would just prefer like a more saturated metal kind of distortion. So in my different amps, I kind of, because I like different kinds of music and I know different kinds of people use my amps, I try to make an amp that kind of, each model kind of, so there's some crossover, but they have different kind of like textures. I would say I would maybe describe it to the distorted sounds, for example, because I know that people like different stuff and different genres kind of music or playing styles kind of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll come back to that in the end. So a couple more of these, we'll wrap up, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Okay.
Ready?
Mm-hmm. That's a capacitor. Those are used for different things in the amp. That one is a filter capacitor. That filters the ripple out of the power supply, usually those ones.
It looks pretty.
That one looks really pretty.
And so what's the point of making something that no one will ever see look pretty?
So you can charge more for it. Because those capacitors are expensive, those F&T, they're German caps. I don't use those. I use like really modern, typically Japanese capacitors, because they have better, you can get them more compact in all sorts of different sizes, and they last a lot longer, better temperature ratings. And
Morgan,
those ones, I still think those are pretty though.
They are pretty. And Morgan in the chat has a relevant comment, which is gut shot culture. What is a gut shot?
RIP Classic Tone. That was a big company that shut down, that made transformers in Chicago. I don't know. They might still be making other transformers, just not audio transformers. But that was like, if you were a DIY amp builder, you'd get a lot of stuff from them.
So what's a gut shot, and why do you need it?
Gut shot culture. Okay, so a gut shot or is showing the inside of an amplifier. A lot of and what that shows is the components used, the circuitry, the layout. I post a lot of pictures of my amp gut shots on Instagram, for example, because I'm really proud of the wiring. I kind of see it as art, and I really do like the aesthetic look of the inside of an amplifier.
But
And
that's not just an aesthetic thing, correct?
no, it's not. However, a lot of people will comment that,
Well, first of all, why is it not just an aesthetic thing? I mean, it looks cool and it probably helps to sell it, but what's the practical purpose of making it look nice?
everything inside the amp needs to be arranged in a physical way, that it, like, in a logical way that makes sense with the way that the electricity is flowing through the amp. And some considerations are noise, like you can't have two things that, like, one thing that might inject noise into some sensitive circuitry. You can't have those things next to each other. You have to pay attention to something called crosstalk, where something from an earlier part in the circuit could jump to a later part in the circuit, like bleed. You could call it bleed. And then heat is another consideration, especially in all amps, but like in tube amps, you have to make sure things aren't getting too hot. The physical spacing, just that everything fits on the chassis and nothing's running into each other. That's like I just spent like 3 days working on a new design for something, doing the layout, the mechanical layout for an amp. So that's kind of
That's
why things
challenging,
are
right?
arranged the way they are.
In a way, that's almost as challenging as the design, correct?
Oh yeah, for me it's more so at this point. I could design like an amp like pretty fast, a schematic, but the layout parts. Also, serviceability, that would be another one, making sure that the amp can be repaired easily.
Why would it ever break?
Well, honestly, like, my amps don't break that much. I've been pretty lucky, but if I have to repair one of my own, even if I have to repair one of my own amps, I want to make sure that I'm not pulling out my hair, and I have to, because Ilya, you'll know from repairing some more modern amps that they're not like really designed to be repaired very easily, and you have to like take the whole thing apart. Sometimes they have stacked circuit boards and all sorts of components that are really difficult to remove.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
sometimes the process of taking it apart and putting it back together is the most time-consuming part, and you don't want that to be.
Oh yeah, like you can sometimes you could open an amp, you could see a resistor is burnt, and you may even know why it's burnt, because it's like a typical problem or something. And then to change the resistor, it's like not even accessible from the top, and you have to take the whole thing apart. So I don't want to make amps like that.
And the amp repair people of the world will be grateful to you for it.
Right, yeah, and then they won't talk shit on the internet.
Okay, 2 more. What's this?
That's a potentiometer. That's a funny little one. Where did you get that?
I don't know. It's from crap pounding.
Yeah, that's a potentiometer. That's just that can be used for a bunch of different things, but what it is really in essence is a really common component in an amp is a resistor. It limits current, and they're used for millions of different purposes, but what a potentiometer is, it's a variable resistor, and you can wire it 2 ways, where it makes what's called a voltage divider, which is like one, if you can imagine 2 resistors like this, the signal coming in this way, and then it basically, the signal gets divided by the 2 resistors. And so what a potentiometer does is, that's what the knob is connected to, by the way. It varies the amount of resistance on either end of the voltage divider, or you can use it as just kind of like making a variable resistor.
So what purpose does it serve other than turning?
Oh, you can use them for lots of things. So very commonly is a volume control or a gain control, but that's also, you can use them to control filter circuits for equalization in your amp.
And so this is the point at which an amp user would be controlling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, more of these or fewer of these in an amp? What would you say?
That's a really hard thing. Like for my personally, as few as possible. A lot of people think they want less controls, and they might if they were having a custom amp built, but it's really hard to design an amp with few controls that works with a Strat and a Les Paul and different different like style guitars, different speakers, different types of music. So what I found is like enough controls and range of controls to work with different guitars. And
Yeah, that's a good point. Because if it was really a one size fits all amp with one knob, it would have to be used with the same guitar, with the same cab, with the same pickups, right?
a lot of people would be disappointed. Because even if you've played live music a lot, when you play in different rooms, the sound changes. And so if you're playing the amp in one room, you may never touch the knobs, but then you find that your settings may change in the different acoustic environment.
Mhm.
So that's like a valuable reason. But I mean, I've played a lot of amps that have little switches and things where I like can't even really hear the difference. And it's just, I think they just put them in for, the engineers are just having fun. So.
Okay, last question, then we're going to open up to Q&A. This is going to be a challenge.
Okay. I don't want to be quizzed. Okay.
I think you're going to get it, but this will be a challenge for you.
Oh, right. Because I don't work on solid state equipment. I think that's a power transistor.
You got it.
Okay. I really am. I'm really a neophyte when it comes to. Okay.
Talk a little bit about why we might use this, which is easy to break on the outside and so big and looks much more expensive than this, if you ask me.
Yeah.
Why would you use one or the other? Or talk about that.
Well, at some point they started replacing tubes with transistors. Transistors are more, they can work at lower voltages, which is nice. They're more physically robust. They're not made of glass. They should have a longer service life. So there's a lot of pros to using transistors. Now, why doesn't everyone use transistors? Because they don't sound like tubes. You can get them to sound, certain ones to sound pretty close to tubes, but they don't sound.
What do you mean? What do you mean they don't sound like tubes? You mean like this sound?
That's a really good, yeah.
Or this sound?
Good question.
It does sound pretty different, but I don't think that's what you're talking about.
No, and mainly the way that they sound when they get overdriven, the way that the signal, if you have a clean signal, if you push the transistor tube into distortion, they have a very distinct sound. And you can most people find the sound of, I don't even want to say that, it's not really true, because
That's okay, you can say it.
A lot of people would say that they prefer the sound of tube clipping over transistor clipping, but I don't really think that's true. People say that.
Might we also be approaching more conversation about how things look a little bit, and how a tube amp and the tubes themselves look a little bit more exciting than this thing?
Mm-hmm. I don't want to say it's like a muscle car versus a Tesla, because that's not the transistor is somewhere in between. Like a power but see, actually now we've moved into a lot of people are so into modeling amps and computer stuff that now even transistor amps are being fetishized. And like, this has been going on for a long time, but people revere and lust after, 70s and 80s transistor amps just as much as they do over the old tube amps, especially like younger people.
Mm-hmm. We might have some of those fetishists among us today. Let's sorry, we went a little long here. So if anybody, we can open up to a Q&A. I have a couple more questions that I can ask, but I'd like to kind of give everybody a chance to pick Alex's brain here. So go ahead. You can either unmute yourself and say your question, or feel free to drop it in the chat. We have one from earlier.
Okay.
Zoom user, I don't know who that is, says, how do you put a spin on an amp? Not sure I get that. What is there to change? More or less distortion?
Yeah, there's like a million things you can change. That's a really good question. So like if it was an old like for example, like let's say we took a Marshall Plexi. It's a fairly simple amp. What would I do to put my own spin on it? Well, first I guess I would listen to it and figure out what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it. So like that amp, for example, I find that there's two channels, two inputs you can plug into. And I find like one of them is so dark, it's not really useful. So I might voice it differently by changing components to make it work better with different guitars and make it more useful. I might find that the amp, I like the quality of the distortion, but I want there to be more. So I might figure out a way to add more distortion. I might not like the quality of the distortion, so I might figure out ways to change the tonality or timbre of the distortion. Like maybe it's too buzzy and I want it to be smoother. Maybe
And, and so is that a lot of this process you're describing here? How much of that is happening in here? How much of that is happening in the computer? And how much of that is happening like in the amp itself, trial and error?
when I first started, it was happening pretty much all hands on. By experimentation, by reading modifications and reading about how specific things changed. It's kind of like if you could use an analogy of like a recipe, you're figuring out like which parts, which ingredients like will, especially like things like more subtle things like spices might change the flavor. But then
So that's a good example, because in that case, you wouldn't really know how it tastes until you try it. So theoretically,
yeah,
you would know, but until you've actually tried it, who knows?
and then the next stage of that is kind of realizing how everything is interactive, or which things are interactive and which things aren't. And and then kind of,
So you're saying go in there and identify, because sometimes you can change a component and it won't make any difference, right? So identify the stuff that's actually relevant to the area of the amp you're working on, and just, you could start with just changing some shit out, or adding something there, right? So is that what you're talking about?
yeah. And yeah, and then figuring out, and then once you understand all the interactions and things like that, and which is, I'm always still learning about that stuff all the time. And because not all just the sound too, it can be the way the amp feels, like there is some interaction between the player and the amp with so adjusting those things as well, and then also putting your own spin on it by like deciding that it needs some extra controls for more versatility, or maybe less controls if you want to make it more minimal or refined.
Mm-hmm.
And then to answer your question, the next part of that would be, then you can kind of like, now I can hear an amp and I can automatically think of what I should do to it, like based on somebody's needs or like my own personal taste. I can think, okay, I would change this here and this here and this here.
And that's from the experience of, at this point, having done it enough to know reliably if I change this, because it's like, even though amps are different and speakers are different, you're keeping a lot of factors constant. So you can kind of tell, if I just change this, then this will be the result.
Yeah, and then I do use some simulation software as well to like test like ideas that I don't want to actually, that are more complicated, or things I'm not sure will work and that I don't want to physically build. You can build them in the computer and look at like spectrum analysis of the waveform to see if it's doing with what you think it's going to be doing and stuff like that.
You said something earlier that I think we have a question that's relevant to, about about like the feel of something. So Watson asks, do you, or have you ever designed amps around certain pickups at all? So this would be like a beautiful synergy to an amp designed to specifically work most beautifully with this instrument, or something like that.
I'd like to do that, but that's honestly one of the biggest challenges of designing amps, because especially trying to keep them simpler, like, because anyone who's played like a guitar with hot and dark humbucker pickups knows it's like the complete polar opposite of a Strat or a Jazzmaster tonally. So it's really hard sometimes to make the amp totally complement different pickups, even if they're just like two iconic pickups like that. So no, it would be really nice to, I mean, I do find that certain amps naturally complement certain pickups more than others. But that also depends on your taste. But no, I've never done that. But for a custom thing, that might be kind of cool. It would
Watson,
take-
yeah, we'll drop Alex's email in there, Watson. You can write him for a quote.
I'm starting to do custom work now. It's pretty fun, but
Okay, Huge asks, how do you decide it is time to create a new design? And we, kind of touched on this earlier, because it's kind of like one morning you wake up and you're like, you know what, it's time for something new. Or is it something that over time kind of you realize that, or is it something that kind of happens gradually?
That's a really good question. I think it happens gradually, because there's been points where I'm like, what other amp would I make? I make all of the, I'm always liking to tweak little tiny subtle aspects of things, but from a bird's eye view, like what haven't I done that I want to do? And sometimes I feel bored, and then eventually like right now, there's a bunch of things I want to make. And I think it partially is my taste changing, but
well,
yeah, that's a good question.
Well, to that question, I guess we can Watson kind of had a follow-up too, which I think is relevant. We're talking about designing an amp for a guitar or whatever, or these things, like what does that even mean? Designing an amp does it mean that it visually matches a Stratocaster? Or does it mean that what tonally would have to be different about the amp to work better with one guitar versus another?
Okay, for example, like a Strat has lots of pickups, but like in general, they're weaker pickups. They don't have as much output. Pretend there's no pedals. I mean, everyone has like a million pedals, so like let's just pretend pedals don't exist for a second. But like they don't have as much mid-range. So you might want to make sure that the amp has more ability to get more mid-range if the person wants. They can be brighter, sometimes shrill with certain amps, so it'd be nice to make sure that the amp isn't too bright, or it has control over the treble brightness, so you can I in a way I kind of think like the perfect amp for like a single coil pickup, for example, is an amp that can let a single coil be what it wants to be, but also almost make it sound like a humbucker, like the opposite end of the spectrum.
So an amp that will give you, if you want it, more versatility.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That seems challenging to design that.
Yeah, like you want to flatter the like you would want to flatter the pickup, but like you want it to work for the other one. And this is honestly, most of my design challenges are honestly trying to get, like, I think if I built an amp for you, Ilya, and you said, this is my guitar, these are my speakers, this is what my band sounds like, this is like my favorite sounds, and I had you in the room and I could get an idea, I could build you an amp with like one knob or no knobs that you would really like, but the next person may hate it. Or if you ever bought a new guitar, you may hate it. So the challenge is not like building something that's specifically for one person that they really like. It's really a lot of the challenges, like making the amp work with all these imaginary guitar players in my head and mind,
Mm-hmm. I'll accept that offer in return for having done this
okay.
But
you can make your own. So yeah.
Jeremy asks, would you consider? I'm not sure if this is he's asking. Would you consider for him? But would you consider making a hybrid amp with a solid state power section? So explain what a hybrid amp is and maybe why you don't make them.
Maybe Jeremy knows because I know Jeremy, but I am going to be doing this, but a hybrid amp is an amp that uses it's like a general term. It's like a hybrid car. It's half electric, half fuel. Well, in this case, it's half tube, half solid state. It's interesting because those kind of amps used to be really looked down on, like amps with tube preamps and solid state power amps, but now they're becoming a little more accepted for some reason. Trends just change. But
What would be the advantage? Why would you like that? Maybe even from a technical perspective. What the solid state, we talked earlier about how we might not like how this sounds. However, there are some advantages to it.
yeah, the advantages of solid state, especially nowadays, with what's called a Class D power amp, you can basically, like, the short of it is you can get a lot of power out of a very small, lightweight package. But those amps are pretty much just designed to operate clean. They'll actually shut down if they clip. They're not designed to clip. So why you would use one is to get something really loud. So the idea is that you generate all the tonal aspects of the amp in the preamp or the earlier part of the amp, and then you're just using the solid state part to make it loud. So why you might use that, it would be in a bass amp that requires more power to get louder, to reproduce the low frequencies loud enough. Now, to build a tube bass amp that is practically loud enough, I mean, it depends on how loud your band is, but a really common amp is an Ampeg SVT, and which is 300 watts, and it's loud, but it's easy these days to find 1,000-watt amp that's this big.
And one of the biggest issues with bigger tubes is bigger transformers, more weight, and then
heavier. It's more expensive to replace the tubes, just like more maintenance. And so the attraction would be making a hybrid amp, is that you could get the tone of the tubes in a smaller amp, lighter amp, and even louder and less expensive too.
So we'll get to Morgan's question a little bit later here. Hunter asks, aren't all the dirt and fuzz pedals basically the same technology as a solid state amp? Or is that a different clipping system? So he's asking about the relationship between, basic solid state design and your average fuzz that's, simple fuzz.
Yes, but they don't have a power amp, and they don't, they don't have a power amp. So, but the preamps, could look really similar. There's actually a lot of pedals people make that are just the preamp section of like a well-known solid state amp, like this guy makes SNK pedals, sneak pedals or something. He makes one of it's like a Ampeg VL1. It's like a famous death metal amp. And it's just
and we have a question from a solid state fetishist here along those same lines. And he asked, do you have a favorite solid state amp?
No. I don't like a jazz chorus. I'll tell you the one. I like a Music Man, but they have a tube power amp, but the Music Man amps sound really good. But some of the old Sun amps, of course, those are the ones everyone likes, like a Beta Lead and stuff. And I like tons of music where people use those. I just find as a player, I can't really connect with those amps, but I hear them all the time and they sound really good to me. I actually like them. The sound mixed with a tube amp too is also a really cool sound, because you get like different.
Yeah, and something you're saying here about tubes that we haven't really touched on is maybe dynamic responsiveness, right? And maybe that's something you miss in solid state amps. So when you say connect with it, you don't mean literally, you mean some other way.
Spiritually. No, I don't know. Maybe I don't really know. I've never really designed solid state amps, so I don't have a lot of experience with how, like, what you can get out of a solid state design. And I mean, I've heard some stuff where people get certain transistors to act and a lot like tubes. So I actually use some transistors in my amps. I forgot. I use them in a way that
switching, or for what are we talking about here?
No, not for that. I do use a solid state relay as part of a channel switching, but that just doesn't have nothing to do with the sound. But I have in my amps, you can get there's an option to get an effects loop, which is a way to insert your effects, to typically time-based effects like delay, flanger, chorus, reverb in your, like if, I don't know if I want to explain all this, if that's interesting, but.
Go ahead. Why would somebody spend money on that?
On an effect, you know what, this is kind of useful because like before I started making amps, I was like, what's an effects loop? Why would anybody want that? That just seems like extra stuff, you know, and that's why I make it optional, because a lot of people don't know or care to know. But so if your amp has distortion that's created in the amp, it's not just a clean sounding amp. What happens is if you put your, like, let's say delay pedal in front of your amp, meaning in the input, in between your guitar and the input of the amp, and you turn up the distortion on your amp, what you're going to be doing is distorting the delay. And that actually can sound really, really cool. And a lot of people have used that, like, you know, like Kevin Shields is probably the most famous person known for doing that, of My Bloody Valentine. But like putting distortion after reverbs and things like that. But if you want it to sound more studio and have clearer repeats, you want to have your time-based effects pedals after the distortion. Well, so how do you do that? You can't put for electronic reasons, you can't put a pedal in between your amp and your speaker. And you could do it like at a mixing board if you're being mic'd up live, the engineer, but you know, you want to have control of your own stuff. So the way that they do it in amps is they put in what's called an effects loop. And that basically comes after the preamp of your amp where all the distortion is created. And then assuming that you're not overdriving the power, those bigger tubes, the power tubes, it allows you to use your effects cleanly, I guess. So you're like, so instead of this is the easiest way to say it. Instead of distorting your delay, you're delaying your distortion, if that makes sense. So what the purpose of the effects loop, all it is to be able to insert your effects into your amplifier circuit path, which is actually like a really difficult thing to design. But
but luckily we have a really good gifted designer.
Right. Thank you. Because you want it to be transparent. Since I make my amps with and without it, I want the ones that don't have it to sound exactly the same as the ones that do have it, when no pedals are plugged in. So one really easy way to do that, or not easy, one way to do that is with transistors, because they can be more transparent than tubes.
And they're smaller and you don't have to worry about drilling big ass holes in the chassis.
Exactly. I can make it modular. It's on a little, this isn't my idea. I saw this has been done before, but it's like on a little board, and I can just plug it in and wire it up. And I have different control panels on the back made so it can be optional.
Andy asks, any features you'd like to implement, but you're not confident the cost would be worth it or appeal to your market, i.e. a particular speaker set, custom knobs, stereo setup, etc. Let me rephrase the question, right? If you knew that somebody, you know, people would be buying your amps for 10 grand and you didn't have to worry, and you had a team of, I don't know, people working for you, you know, and you could tell them what to do, and you had like, you know, free reign, I guess, over what went into the amp, what would you put there that you're not really able to do now?
That's a really cool question. I honestly would I am limited a lot by cost. Like I would probably have like, so I'm going to be designing a new line of combo amps. And if you really look at combo amps, you'll notice, for example, most of them have the same grill cloth, the part that covers the speaker. And the reason is there's just not, you know, it's all made in China for the most part at like one factory, and every distributor carries the same 20 grill cloths. And it's not, and a lot of them are just like variations in color. And if you look at a lot of vintage amps, they have like crazy cool grill cloth designs.
Like the blue one on the Fender amps, you kind of get that blue silver tone, right? Or maybe the like,
yeah, you can still get, you can get like all those classic ones you can get, but like if you look at old like an old Selmer amp, or just like some of the more, I don't know, there's just tons of the really old ones have really cool kind of psychedelic grill cloths and stuff. So like I would maybe get some things like that, maybe have like my own custom Tolex made that had its own texture.
So we're talking about fabric and not about electronics.
Yes, this is just aesthetic.
Mhm.
As far as electronics, they make everything you would want. But as far as like feature, okay, and then so there's some aesthetic things. Maybe custom knobs would be cool. But as far as like features, that's another interesting question too. Like some people have ever asked if like maybe do
Well, I'll suggest one you can say whether it'd be worth it. Some
Okay.
amps, like some weird modern carve-ins and things like that, they have the option to switch between different power tubes, like a different set of power tubes, for example, right? I'm
Yeah,
not interested. We already determined
it's
that you think.
it's gimmicky.
Mhm.
No offense to Carvin though. But or Mesa Boogie does that a lot. It's actually in any of my amps you can use different power tubes with a bias adjustment, but there's no way to like there's no like switches on the back to flip between two different ones or blend them together. I find those things are subtle and they're not very useful to most people. But they help to sell amps. As
Mhm.
far as like
What about effects then? You know, a lot of amps have more built-in. I mean, I'm talking about chorus and reverb and stuff like that, right? You know, some amps, for example, might have like a stereo chorus where you know different. So if you were using a cab with more than one speaker, it could be chorusing between the speakers. Is that something you're interested in, or is that something you think should be more pedal driven and not more amp driven?
yeah, there's no really reason that to put that in an amp. That probably would turn more people off than it would attract people, just because people are just like there's so many cool options with pedals. But I have thought about doing like a tube fuzz circuit in an amp or like a reverb, like a more elaborate reverb. I have an amp with a pretty elaborate reverb, but something that has like a reverb driven by a power tube, like the old Fender 6G15 reverb units, the ones that sit on top of the amps. But it's pretty expensive. You need a more expensive reverb transformer and the power tube, and it's more circuitry. And I'm just not sure people would really, but maybe something like that.
Mhm, mhm.
Just more tubes, like things where you could blend um channels or something. But or stereo amp maybe, but yeah, I just find for most people that a lot of that stuff's not useful. So I pretty much am able to do everything like as far as features that I would want to do. I am going to be doing I'm doing a custom amp right now that has like 2 rows of knobs. So each channel is totally not what's the word?
Just like you can control it separately.
Discrete. Yeah, each channel's like discrete. So like
Mhm.
each channel has its own EQ. And I've like, I just haven't had the panel space to do that before, but I'm doing like a custom
Mhm.
that has that. And that's pretty fun to do because you don't have to make as many compromises that way with the design.
Okay, so let's see. I think we have about 2 more questions here, then we'll wrap it up. Morgan asks, he has a 2-part question. The second part is, I think, QAnon Morgan is made it in here as well. So I don't think we're going to address that. But the first part, what is the highest voltage you've been electrocuted by? We started off on this question.
Well, I'm going to be that guy and I'm going to say electrocuted means death by electricity.
Shocked.
Shocked by the highest voltage, probably not that high. Probably not that high.
Seems like you've developed some good habits from your mentor, Dale.
Yeah, I build an amp that has almost 700. My 200-watt models have almost 700 volts as the highest voltage in the amp, and I have not touched that yet. I've been very cautious around it. I feel like you'll be more likely to get shocked when you're not paying attention. I've been shocked. What hurts is getting shocked by the because it's high current, the line voltage from the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people have probably felt that. It just makes you feel it'll ruin your day.
Mm-hmm. Or it could make your day. We have a question here. This is a broader question, and we can kind of maybe sort of move towards the end of our discussion here. What other things inspire or interest you design-wise? And what's the story of your cool backdrop curtain? And those things, Zoom user, little do they know that those 2 questions are connected.
Oh yeah, yeah. So those curtains, I made those curtains. out of some fabric I got off eBay. I like to sew. Uh, it's a hobby because I like to just mainly to hem my own pants and stuff, but I'd like to get more into that. Other aspects of design.
Well, I mean, you already mentioned one because this is relevant to amps, but when when I opened the door for you to have unlimited amp power, the first thing you talked about was Tolex and grill cloth, right? So it does sound like you have an interest in, I don't know really what you call that, but the visual part of it, maybe
Yeah, I think of it as like industrial design because it's like product design.
textiles. Thank you, Austin. Textile art. Perfect.
Oh, I guess I do. It's cool because my girlfriend's been making rugs with this tufting gun. It's like this gun you can make rugs. She's really more into that stuff than me, but my sister was into my sister did fiber arts, and my mother made quilts and things like that. So maybe I get that from them. But
I guess maybe like, let's say that after January 20th, the electricity doesn't work anymore and amps become pointless, and you have to resort to another creative hobby to either pass the time or make ends meet. What would that be?
That's really interesting. I'm trying to think, is there anything? I don't know. I actually, so in a different life, I thought I would become a fashion designer.
Well, okay, now we're getting closer to the truth, I think.
I'm half Italian, so.
I mean, so far you mentioned you wouldn't like how you looked in 2009 based on the cut of your shirts, right? Your ideal, if you had all the money in the world, you would just buy nicer Tolex, right? And fashion design. So that's relevant, right? To the kind of the topic of the talk was the art of amplification. So maybe
I do care a lot about that.
Mm-hmm. And leave us with just kind of your thoughts. We didn't really touch on this because I'm not a capitalist, so I didn't want to talk about the business aspect of things too much, but it's very, I feel like it's relevant for everybody here. Maybe just talk about the business side of things, why you think your business is successful, whether you think it's successful, I guess the first question, and if it is, why you think that is, and what advice you can give to kind of aspiring maybe amp makers, but also kind of like DIY business people out there, which we could have talked more about that, but.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I never intended to be a business owner. I really don't like being a business owner. I don't like that aspect of it. I like having control and being my own boss. That is what I like about it. I don't like being an employee. I'm kind of my employee to my customers, but I have like a lot more freedom. Like when the pandemic happened, not much changed for me. I work from a home shop and I'm able to do that. But what's made it successful, I've been able to keep really low overhead by working from home and making amps to order, selling amps direct to customers, not having distributors. I never was interested in having my amps in shops or anything like that. Although it could be cool, but I virtually spent no money on marketing, and I've just kind of, I grew up playing in, and I still do play in like, the punk world of DIY and how do you get people to know about your band? You just go on tour and you just keep doing your thing, and eventually people will notice or they don't. And I kind of carried that over to my business. I kind of just keep doing what I'm doing. And then, I do have an Instagram page and stuff like that. That's been actually really, without that, I don't know how many people I would have reached, but more towards the beginning, before I ever had that, it was, people would play them in bands and then other people would see them. And so it kind of grew in a very slow way. I never had an intention to start. I'm not a very successful business person. I've seen other musical instrument companies just like go crazy like in like a year's time because they just put all their energy into marketing and stuff like that. But I'm just more into the design and stuff and just, I don't know.
So name quickly just 3 reasons why you think people would buy people buy your amps.
They're loud.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot of loud amps. They look cool.
Okay, that's important. That's one. The first one didn't count. So they look cool. What else?
They're not. I should probably think about this stuff more myself. I should probably figure it out and keep doing that. They're not overly complicated. They like kind of remind you of a vintage amps, but are not, not just copies. So
That's good. So
they're a mix of like original and new.
They're a new take on an old story. That's two. I guess overly complicated works as well. What about, just a final question, how much do you feel like your personality comes out in the things that you make?
Probably more than probably not very much. I think my amps seem kind of like really serious.
And you're not?
No, not at all. But yeah, like I'm not sure they do. Maybe just but what's interesting is my taste comes through the amp, whether I realize it or not. I find that sometimes my amps sound more similar to, like, my different models sound more similar to each other than they sound different. And I realize that, like, I just have a natural way of voicing amps, even when I'm trying to make them work with different guitars and this and that. There is something that is just like innate in it's not, something that I'm in my ear that makes me voice amps a certain way. And I guess that's how musical equipment designers develop like their sound, and they might not even, and I don't even really realize I'm doing it, but I think in retrospect I kind of realize that my amps do have a sound.
So yeah, for the aspiring kind of DIY amp makers out there, you would say to kind of trust that instinct.
Yeah, they always say trust your ears.
Who says that?
The old timers.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Just a comment. Sorry, we have one more here. Everyone says the loudness and clarity of the crunchiness of my science fiction amp is something they love and totally appreciate. It's reliably loud. So maybe one thing we didn't touch on is getting loud, but remaining clear, right?
Yeah, and not breaking. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Alex has one of my really early amps. I've known him for a long time, so that's really cool.
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us. I hope that everyone enjoyed our talk here and learned at least a few things that they didn't know.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, hopefully we kept it, from just nerdy enough, but not too nerdy. And yeah, everybody enjoyed it. And
yeah, I hope it wasn't too boring. Yeah, I really appreciate everyone for tuning in. It was pretty fun.
Yeah, and I dropped a link to the Holland thing again, if anyone wants to toss a couple bucks so we can keep this good programming going. And we'll look out. Oh yeah, your website? Oh,
it's just scienceamps.com.
And if people want to hit you up about custom builds now that we've sold that, what's a good way to do that?
Man, I'm down. It's really fun for me, although it's a lot of work. But if you're not interested in anything I'm already making, I am doing some custom stuff. So, and I have new stuff coming this year. But yeah, you can email me at info@scienceamps.com.
Okay, so info@scienceamps.com and just scienceamps.com, right?
And it's just me. You only ever talk to me.
And we'll be offering 75% off for any attendees at this.
I wish I could make everyone amps for free. Honestly, I'm not a capitalist either. So if that was the way it could be, I would do it.
But hey, it's a lot of work, and we really appreciate it. And keep up the good work. And we're excited to see what shit you come up with next.
Oh, everybody's so nice. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.